Adolph Luetgert was a powerfully built, coarse-looking man who owned a sausage factory on Chicago's Hermitage Avenue and Diversey Boulevard. He was married twice. From his first wife, he had a grown son named Arnold, and from his second wife, Louise, he had two boys named Elmer and Louis. The family lived on Hermitage Avenue, right next to the factory. On May the 1st, 1897, Mrs. Luetgert mysteriously vanished. Her husband did not seem bothered by her absence. He promoted the theory that she committed suicide because of his business failure. Mrs. Luetgert's brother, Dietrich Bickness, called to see her on May the 4th, and Luetgert informed him that she had been missing for 3 days. He admitted that he had not notified the police or taken any steps to locate her. Bickness called the police after noticing Luetgert's apathy, and Captain Herman Schuttler launched an investigation. The mysterious disappearance drew a lot of media attention. The police conducted a large-scale search, including dragging the river, but nothing was discovered. Captain Schuttler decided to limit his investigation to the factory in general, but to a large vat in particular, and the mystery was solved quickly. 2 gold rings, one with the initials LL engraved inside, a tooth, and 2 corset steels were discovered in the sediment at the bottom of the vat. Mrs. Louise Luetgert's rings were positively identified as hers. A part of a skull and other human bones were discovered in the yard where the animal bones were thrown. It was discovered that between May the 2nd and May the 17th, Luetgert made numerous attempts to gain access to the factory. The sheriff's deputies in charge always refused him admittance. Luetgert was arrested on May the 18th and indicted by a grand jury 4 days later. He unsuccessfully sought his release through a writ of habeas corpus. On August the 7th, the prosecution obtained a corpse and boiled it in caustic potash for 2 hours in the same vat where Mrs. Luetgert's body was destroyed. In the end, nothing but fluid remained of the fleshy parts of the body, and all bones except the large ones had been destroyed. This proved their theory to be correct. The trial of Luetgert before Judge Tudhill began on August the 24th. According to Luetgert's attorney, he also conducted a test with a corpse, but the boiling process did not dissolve it. The defense claimed that no crime was committed and that Mrs. Luetgert was not dead but was in seclusion. Alderman Schlake received a letter signed by Louisa Luetgert in which the missing woman was represented as saying she was then living with friends in Chicago. It was later revealed that the handwriting bore no resemblance to that of the missing woman. The letter was sent to confuse the authorities. Nicholas Faber, Emma Skimsky, and Gottlieb Skimsky testified that they saw Luetgert enter his factory around 10 p.m. on May the 1st with a woman about the size of Mrs. Luetgert. Frank Bioch, a watchman at the factory, testified that on this night, Luetgert told him to bring down 2 barrels of caustic potash and place them in the boiler room, after which Luetgert poured the contents of both barrels into one of the vats. The watchman was told to keep up the pace all night, and at 10 p.m., Luetgert dispatched him to the drugstore in search of nerve medication. When he returned, Luetgert was in the room with the vats with the door locked. Bialk also testified that he lived at the residence of Police Officer Klinger and that on May the 6th, Luetgert had summoned him. Luetgert was admitted to Bialk's room after concealing the officer under his bed, and in suppressed excitement, he asked if the officers had discovered anything at the factory. No, Bialk replied, and Luetgert, relieved, remarked, "That's very good." He then warned the watchman not to tell the police anything and promised him that when the factory reopened, good jobs would be available for Bialk and his son. Frank Odorsky, a factory employee who assisted Luetgert in placing the caustic potash in the vat, testified that he had never seen caustic potash used in the factory before. Mrs. Agatha Tosh, whose husband ran a saloon across the street from the factory, testified that she saw smoke coming from the factory chimney on the night of May the 1st, although the factory was supposed to be closed at that time. She also stated that Luetgert visited her the next day and asked her not to mention the smoke because it would get him into trouble. Chas Hengst stated that he was driving by the factory around 10 p.m. on May the 1st when he heard what sounded like a person screaming. Carl Vogler, a chemist, testified that there was no need for caustic potash in a sausage factory. Mrs. Christina Felt, a widow with whom the defendant was once in love, testified that Luetgert frequently expressed his hatred for his wife and hinted that he would get rid of her. According to Dr. Chas Gibson and Professor de la Fontaine, the masses of soft substance that had presumably boiled over the vat were flesh that had been burned by potash. Particles extracted from the vat's drain pipes were proven to be human bone fragments. Luetgert handled these exhibits in a cold-blooded manner, demonstrating that he was emotionless. According to Professor George Dorsey of the Field Columbian Museum, one of the bones discovered in the pile of animal bones was the upper portion of a woman's left thigh bone. Chas Winters of 250 Orleans Street was arrested during the trial for attempting to imitate Mrs. Tosh, the witness who saw smoke coming from the chimney in the sausage factory on the night of May 1st. Captain Schutzler testified about Luetgert's indifference to the fate of his wife and the outcome of his official investigations. The defense began on September the 24th, and several witnesses testified that they had seen a woman who resembled Mrs. Luetgert in various locations since May the 1st. The prosecution claimed that Luetgert was tired of his second wife and wanted her out of the way so that he could marry Mary Simmering, the family's servant. The girl testified for the defense on September the 25th and described Luetgert's kind treatment of his wife. She denied having relations with Luetgert, although members of the grand jury testified that she had told them about her inappropriate relationships with the defendant. The defense then presented many experts to counteract the testimony of the prosecution's experts. Luetgert's business partner, William Charles, testified that caustic potash was purchased to make soft soap as they planned to clean the factory before selling it to an English syndicate. To refute this testimony, Deputy Sheriff Frank Moen testified that when he took possession of the property, there were over 100 boxes of soap in stock, indicating that there was enough for cleaning. The case was presented to the jury on October the 18th, and after 66 hours of deliberation, they were unable to reach an agreement, with 9 voting for conviction and 3 voting for acquittal. The second trial began on November the 29th, 1897, and Luetgert appealed to the public for financial assistance, but few people responded. On January the 19th, 1898, the defendant took the stand in his own defense for the first time. The trial resulted in a conviction, and on May the 5th, Luetgert was sentenced to life in the Joliet State Prison. Luetgert left his cell at 6 a.m. on July the 27th, 1899, and returned shortly after with his breakfast pail. But he died from heart disease just as he was about to eat it. Following his death, Frank Pratt, a member of the Chicago Bar, stated that he went to Joliet in February 1898 to consult a client named Chris Mary, and being a bit of a palmist, he asked Luetgert if he wanted his hand read. The latter agreed, and Pratt told Luetgert that he had a violent temper and was not always responsible for his actions. According to Pratt, Luetgert then virtually admitted to killing his wife while possessed by the devil. Pratt is quoted as saying that he considered this an admission to be a professional secret and thus did not feel free to reveal it until after Luetgert's death. According to reports, Luetgert made similar admissions to another prisoner.